Today, as I mentioned, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dame. Dave is a Senior Director of Product Accessibility at Microsoft. He's a world-leading expert in agile product management and organizational change. Dave has faced many challenges along his leadership journey, including cerebral palsy. But as Dave likes to say, I have cerebral palsy, but cerebral palsy doesn't have me. Dave brings an incredible passion for leading and growing people, not just those that are present in his organization today, but those that have ever been part of his organization, including with folks like myself that we only met a few weeks ago. So I know he brings an incredible openness to the topic of leadership and growing people. He's incredibly passionate about creating hardware and software solutions that empower people with disabilities to enhance their quality of life. So with that, I really want to welcome Dave. Dave, thank you for being with us here today. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing great. Super excited for our talk today and get to meet a bunch of new people that's on the call. So yeah, I'm really jazzed about this.
Awesome. Well, Dave, I wanted to start off, some folks in the audience may have seen your TED Talk video, some may not have, but I think for folks to really get to know you, the moment that really caught me when I was watching that TED Talk, where you talked about your journey, your leadership journey, and your philosophy, and frankly, a lot of the struggles you've faced in your life. When you talked about at the very beginning, I believe it was your first job, and you said, "Hey, it took me 12 hours to do the work that peers around you were getting done in 8." But
Right.
you were there trying to get work done, even though it was taking longer, and other sacrifices you were making just to be there and to make it, including not being able to use the bathroom.
Right. Yeah, that was the most challenging thing. So let's go back to the year of 1995, right? Before there was even a computer on each desk. Despite having a university degree, it took me over a year to find my first job. So when I got my first job, it was a logistics coordinator. These hands weren't made for paperwork, but I found an office where my power wheelchair could navigate and drive around. So I was just happy to have a job. And I remember my first day, I went to go into the bathroom and realized my chair couldn't get through the door. And I was like, I had a decision to make at that time. I could have, raised the flag and said, I can't get my wheelchair in here. But because it took me so long to find my first job, I decided to keep that in silence. So I would very discreetly drink as minimal of water as I could each day. Because, like you said, I was working 12 hours a day to get what others got to do in 8 hours a day. So, in order to not look like an outlier, I did my best to work overtime and make sure that I really restricted my fluid intake in order to do that. And wonderfully, technology became the mainstream in the workplace, and I got my first computer. They gave it to me because I studied computers in university. And there was this new thing that came out. You guys might have heard about it. It was called the internet. So what I did on the weekend was I created a website where people could sign up for their own training. And also the venues could sign up for the events they wanted to host. So what was taking me 12 hours was now only taking me 3 hours a day. The guy in the wheelchair was finishing his work in half the time. I was like, who's disabled now? And I credit my disability to be able to see differently, to see things different, to see the opportunity for change. So I went from me being the outlier to I caused the rest of the organization to be an outlier. And we began changing the way we did things. And that was my start. And I got an early thing into leadership.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Wow. Especially when, you talk about the advent of technology and how it changed your own trajectory personally. Can you share? I'm curious to build from that. Today you're in such an well-run organization. You're a senior director at Microsoft, but there was that start at the very beginning, and it seems like technology had a huge role to play. But I'm curious, are there other key moments in your life that really shaped your career trajectory and big pivotal moments, or maybe even just ways in which you saw work and saw it as an opportunity for you to open up opportunities in your career path?
Well, when I was born in 1971, my parents were told I wouldn't live past 12. I may never be able to speak clearly, if at all. And even if I did, to not expect much, because there's not much in the world that somebody with cerebral palsy could do. And it wasn't like my parents were visionaries. They were very blue collar workers and they knew what hard work was, but they knew they didn't want to make the one decision that was going to impact my whole life. So what they did is, and you got to think back then, there was not even any rights that would allow a person with a disability to attend regular school. So they had to work with people. They had to work with OT therapists, the school boards to really change those things. And I really got to see the power of the collective. And I think my biggest moment was when I went to university. I remember I didn't know if I wanted to go to school for computer science or business because I was really good at both of those. Or do I want to take a year off to find myself? With my dad being a blue collar person, option 3 was not an option. But I remember him walking down the stairs saying, David, let's be honest, you're not going to be a fireman, police officer, or a construction worker. But you know what else you're not going to be? Living under my roof for free the rest of your life. But when I went away for university, I wasn't going to bring my parents with me. And at the time, my parents got me out of bed, showered me, and dressed me to go. So I think that was the start of my leadership journey because I had to hire complete strangers in order to get them to be able to get me out of bed, shower me, and dress me. So imagine the vulnerability you needed to interview someone one day and be completely naked in front of them 3 days later. But it was when I went away for school, I realized what the power of working with people that I could accomplish. Because individually, physically, I hit the ceiling really quickly. But in being able to really have the Team Davy, that I had to, at an age of 18, so most people just got to move away, learn what it's like to live away from home and do their studies. I had to learn what it was like to hire someone, set a process in play, keep them engaged and excited. And if one person can't come, what can they do to cover? So I learned very early that my impact could be through others and the ability to make people greater than the sum of their parts. And I'm blessed that I had a disability that allowed me to be able to hone those skills early on, because when you get the right humans together, when you can get people together with similar passions or even differences, but then connect with each other, like that's been part of my journey. And when I did that earlier story about using technology, that was when it was starting to give me people and teams. And I just had to learn to really learn each individual in themselves and then learn how they work with each other.
That is such a story of perseverance and optimism. It makes me also wonder, it's reminding me of a simple transitions in life sometimes, such as, you have kids and later on, in addition to our commute, we also have to drop off the kids. And I'm like, oh my God, this is taking even more time. And I'm hearing your story and going, wow, you had so many things built into your schedule that you had to be able to do in order to just to be able to step into the world. And I remember seeing something very recently where you were traveling and even just some of your luggage was damaged, right? Because people aren't trained to handle accessibility.
Well, actually, it was my power wheelchair.
Mm.
And then you got to think, I was going to a partner event because they weren't really being careful. They broke my chair again. It happens more times than I would like to reflect on. But you got to think what the person tried to do was carry all my parts up in one trip. So for him trying to save an extra trip, he impacted my 3-day trip. Because with my wheelchair, I get my independence, I get my agency. It's like if they would accidentally shatter your legs. It's not like it's a car, right? They like to compare it with a car. And I wish it was as easy to swap out as a car. It's essentially if they would hurt your legs, how would you get around with like 1 minute to think about what are you going to do now?
Yeah. And I'm curious, I mean, one, yeah, it's so difficult to imagine that because, yeah, at least a person, for still walking, we can go take an Uber, we can go get on the public transport. There's many other options. I'm curious through these different sets of events, those that happen earlier in life, like where you had to be incredibly vulnerable to these things, like we're talking about your wheelchair, which is very recent. What's a mindset that you've developed that helps you keep going despite the the daily work it requires to how have you developed that inner strength and what helped you in that journey? I'm really curious to understand.
I wasn't always like this. Like I would early on in my career, I used to try to mask my disability. And you might ask yourself, how would you mask a power wheelchair? But I would always try to be like, nothing bothered me. I have no challenges. I'm just like you and everyone else. And one of my people on my team came to me and said, Dave, we don't follow you because we don't think you struggle. We follow you because you struggle and continue to persevere and have the outcomes like you do, putting us first. So that made me realize instead of all the effort I'm putting in to cover it up, to just kind of embrace being human and vulnerable. And when a situation like that comes, I simply just kind of, pardon the pun, I take a step back or a roll back and go, I'm going to do the best I can with what I have. And if you can make peace with, I'm going to do the best I can with what I have. Because as a leader, sometimes you get overly confident where I can control everything, right? There's everything amongst my control. I lead this organization. I can control how the world reacts and operates. But the reality is we don't. The world is going to change, situations are going to happen. But the one thing I do have control is how do I react? How do I show up? And how do I just, do the best I can with what I have at the moment? So I think learning to accept the situation and forgive yourself to not maybe meet your expectation if the situation hadn't happened. Because
Yeah.
as a leader, I'm good at coaching someone through that, but it's really hard to coach yourself.
Yes. Yes. And there's always the sense of like, oh, I wish things were ideal, or we had, even walking into just any typical day, like if things happened in this particular sequence today, everything would be perfect. Funny enough, right before I'm about to uh, start the session today and speak with you, my doorbell rings and the mailman's like, I dropped the mail accidentally in your box that belongs to your neighbor. So I'm running, opening the mailbox, trying to get him the mail. And I'm like, okay, there's a purpose to this. And we can handle this with calm while trying to get on the conversation that we're about to have today. So I love just the simplicity of, how are we showing up? What kind of reaction are we having to the situation? and doing the best with what we have at our disposal in that moment. We can always prep for perfect in the future, right? But what can we do with what's at hand? Dave, I'm really a question that's coming up for me that's been very present, learning about your story and hearing you speak, is this sense of inclusivity. You know, the topic of diversity, DEI, these topics are very present in our culture today. But I'm curious to hear from you, what does the term inclusivity or being an inclusive leader mean for you? And I'm curious if you can share anything around that and how you try to show up as an inclusive leader, and what kind of a culture that you have helped create in your organization.
You know, the one thing I always find interesting, we call it diversity and inclusion. I think it should be called inclusion and diversity, because until I feel welcome, you're not going to attract me into an environment that seems to be very different than me. Like by nature, every team I became part of, it's been a diverse team just by default of me rolling in. And I remember early on, I would spend the effort to try to fit in the box, right? Be that right culture fit, be the right in the box. But as I got older, I got to see how my differences, or what made me uniquely different than you and others, was what was going to make the organization resilient. Because then, if you can get a bunch of outliers, to me, if you have inclusion, diversity is the lagger, because you're going to attract many different diversities. What I really enjoy in a diverse team is the cognitive diversity, the different lived experiences because of the diversity in the human that comes together to look at a problem with all different lenses. I've had people on my team that disagree with me like every single time, and my peers would be like, well, they're not being a good team, they're not being a good team player. And I'm like, oh, they are. I need them to keep the rest of us honest and really try to, challenge those assumptions and move it. So I think getting the multiple lenses, the multiple voices, gives us a way where we can see the problem at all different angles before we try to quickly solve it. Because as humans, we quickly try to solve a problem, right? It comes and we're like, we want to knock it out right away. But I think in today's complex world and technology, with the way the world is changing, the way we're all changing as humans, if we can get really good at looking at that problem longer from multiple perspectives, you get a more inclusive solution that works for many. Because, I think especially as we're building global products, if they're not made up of representatives of everyone that uses our product, how are we going to make sure we're in sync, to make sure we, the producers, represent all of us as consumers? And how do we make sure that goes? But as a leader, I try not to, like if I have a team of 10 people, I don't try to treat them all the same. I try to really get to know them as an individual, see what they need, because everybody has a different motivation and a thing that deflates them. But I try to learn them because it's my job to be able to understand and appreciate their uniqueness. So that way, as we become together as diverse kind of perspectives, if we can know how to interact with each other to get the best out of it, that's where each instrument sounds like a beautiful song. And that's where I'm just curious about people, right? Like, it was funny. I was telling my new leader the other day, I couldn't talk until I was 12. And he was like, that must have been frustrating. And I said, sure. But what it taught me was to be a good listener, to be a great observer. So even though I couldn't talk, I really got to be able to observe and ingest, because humans fascinate me, right? To understand. And as a leader, I want to learn you as an individual. I want you to learn me as an individual, because I'm a different person with you than I might be with someone else. But that's because that's our unique combination. And appreciating the unique combinations is what really tries to, because you can hire for diversity, but if you don't lead with diversity and inclusion, you end up getting everybody a lot like you. And as a leader, it's an easy kind of bias to happen, right? Everybody's like, I want to be like my leader because I want to succeed or grow. And I have to be like, no, I'm different than what my predecessor was. And whoever, you're going to be different than me. So appreciate the different styles and approaches to really show that we don't have to be all exactly the same to be an impactful team.
Yeah. And this sense of, creating a culture where those kind of conversations are possible and different, people's opinions are respected and heard is so key to I feel what you're sharing here, especially like what I'm hearing underneath. There's deep psychological safety that you've created for your team so that they can share something with you that to others may feel like, oh yeah, are they being a team player because they're perhaps opposing your point of view. And this question comes up a lot. I'm fascinated by people as well, in my work, and hence why I'm a coach. And this question comes up a lot. Hey, sometimes I say something in my teams and it's crickets. No one speaks, even though we're asking for feedback. And we haven't, perhaps created the culture that can facilitate or create the space for a conversation like that to occur. And other times it's like, well, all these other people, these seniors, they feel intimidating and I don't know how to voice myself. So I'm curious if you can speak to a little bit of how do you create psychological safety in your team and what helps with that to kickstart that culture and to keep it going?
That's a great question. I think when we feel safe, we all perform at our best. It's when we get worried about the impact of being wrong or making a mistake, being very kind of like, oh no, I can't do that. I can't, I think I was talking earlier about the 5K walk I did to raise money for cancer. And I remember when I was training, I could only walk so far, and that was it. What was holding me back was my fear of falling, because I thought if I fell, I would hurt myself and I wouldn't be able to do it. And the first time I fell, so I was probably only doing like 400 feet when I was training, getting ready. But the minute I fell and got back up, I started doing a kilometer and a half, 2 kilometers. Yes, I'm Canadian. That's why I'm saying kilometers. Um, so I think when you fall, there's a strength to that. So when I'm getting a team, what I try to do in our regular team meetings, I share my mistakes because luckily I make enough of them. I got plenty to share. And I think by me sharing my mistake, and then I try to explain why I made that mistake. Like here was how I viewed it. I should have got more input. I should have done whatever I should have done. I make it safe where if I can share my biggest mistakes, and then I ask to go around the room to go, hey, did anyone do a slip up today? And then after they get good at sharing their mistakes, I slowly change the language and go, what did we learn this week? What did we learn? So now it's not classified as a mistake, it's classified as a learning opportunity. And I don't want to just measure my team on outcome and outputs. I want to measure how much they've grown because I think how I measure my success is how they move on. How they move on beyond me, they might move up. I go, one of my proudest things is I've had 7 people that I had the privilege to lead that are now at the C level. Now, I've never wanted to be at the C level or even more senior than I was at my last job. That's what got me to Microsoft because I find the further up you go, the further you are from doing the things you love. You create the environment so everybody can do what they love. So I like to find that right altitude, but I think in growth, you need to be able to feel safe to make mistakes. And I think you got to lead by example, right? Because everybody, I've always heard senior people go, fail fast and fail often. Great. What was your biggest mistake? Silence, right? So I usually like to lead by showing, here's some of the mistakes I made with, I had good intentions, like everybody does that makes a mistake. But the reality is the world's too deep and complex to always make the right decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and each situation, demands something so unique at times. Like, I love when you were earlier talking about how viewing people in our teams as individual instruments that, everyone has their own tune, their own sort of wavelength at which they're at. And it's similar with situations. To say that we can handle every situation every time perfectly would kind of defeat all purposes of learning. I feel like, part of the intention with life in general is we're in a school where we're meant to make mistakes and learn and continue to grow and expand. And frankly, if we're not making mistakes on at least a yearly basis, something where we kind of really screwed up and could reflect back and learn from, we're probably not taking big enough risks.
And as a leader, the biggest challenge is, because you care, allowing other people to make mistakes, right? So how do we leave enough room in the timeline? Because I was bad at this when I first started out as a leader. I wanted to save people from making the mistakes. And what I had to learn was two things. If I let them go their own way, they're going to learn themselves from making a mistake, or they did it better than I did when I made the mistake, and I learned a better way to do it. So the hardest part as a leader, like, we can be okay with mistakes, but how do you create the space and opportunity for your people to make mistakes and to be able to learn from them?
Yeah, and to recognize them and learn from them, and frankly help the rest of the team learn from them. So Dave, we're going to take some questions from the audience. We actually have one in chat right now, which is a question from Salim Alam. He's saying, question for Dave, going through such challenging circumstances, did you ever struggle with anxiety? And if so, what strategies did you utilize to overcome that?
Great question. I've always had anxiety. It's both a blessing and a curse. I think it's always made me resilient to be stronger, but a curse was never feeling like you did enough, feeling overwhelmed, doing everything. What I try to do in those moments is to step away. Again, I'm using the wrong analogy, but I try to get away from the situation and either listen to music, read a book, or just allow myself to step away from this, to be able to refresh my perspective. And then I got to remind myself, what can I do the best of with what I have? And even though I'm still nervous and scared, like, you just learn to break it into smaller chunks. Like, and what I've always done is, like I said earlier, great at giving coaching advice and leading others, terrible at taking it myself. And I would think to myself, how would I coach Aaron to do this? How would I help him or her get over their anxiety? And then I would be like, why don't I do that to myself? Why don't I do that for myself to do that? So it's doing for yourself that you would do to others, right? It's kind of doing that way of coaching yourself and putting yourself, or sometimes what I will do is, because I want to build a deeper connection with my team, I'll be honest with one of my team members and go, I'm feeling overwhelmed and scared. And part of you don't want to show that as their leader. But when they can see, like, oh my God, Dave has anxiety about this too, and they start coaching me down, then it's showing that we're all in this together, right? Just because I have anxiety doesn't mean I'm no better of a leader. It's I'm human. I get anxiety and I need your help. This help and growing each other go both ways. And I find what I found actually, by them doing it for me, they're more open to doing it for their peers and the rest of the team too. So I think when I've learned to be vulnerable, when I've learned to be naked in front of them, uh, philosophically speaking, it really shows you the strength of humanity. Because being in a wheelchair, I've seen the worst of people. Like, don't get me wrong, there's people that have been just like rude, obnoxious, bullying. But then I've seen the greatness of people where if my chair got stuck on the ice crossing a major street, somebody would run and pull me over back to the sidewalk. So, in seeing the different ranges of humanity, really makes me feel comfortable of being vulnerable to them.
Yeah. And we still have you. Yes, you're back.
Oh, there we go. Good. I was getting worried. I hope all that went through because
yes,
I don't know if I'd remember it again because I'm just answering these off my chest. So
yeah, no, I certainly heard it, and it was beautiful, and just to hear you talk about anxiety and showing how you're sharing that anxiety with your team. It's not something that we have to keep to ourselves. Often as leaders, sometimes we have this image of, I've got to show up in front of the team. I've got to know which way we're supposed to head, share it, have everyone buy into it, and then let's start rowing in that direction. And some of the best conversations that, best meetings that I remember with my leaders were when the leader came in and said, "Hey, I think we have a problem. Let's first like get all on the same page about, do we all agree this is the problem? And then I don't necessarily have the answer. I think maybe this might be one of the solutions, but can we all brainstorm and come up with several solutions and then go figure out, do they feel right? Come back in a few days and see whether that is the direction we want to row." Those have been some of the most amazing conversations. I feel like you were talking about some of the same things, which is we don't have to come up with all the answers. We actually need to just lead the conversation in a way that we facilitate the conversation. We make sure the conversation for around important thing occurs such that the right solution, the best one we can identify at the time, can surface up, and then we can all buy into that as a team and row together.
And one of the biggest skills you can learn as a leader is, this as a coach, because I was trained with this as a coach too, is the power of silence. Because the longer you leave it silent, it allows people to speak up. So I've learned where I can stay in a room silent for 2 minutes. And you as a coach know how hard that is to build up. But as a leader, we got to do the one talking. Where if you want to get the collective of the whole, you just got to get used to building your tolerance to be comfortably silent, to let other voices emerge.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That was difficult for me in the beginning. Now I love it. Now I'm just silent and I let people ruminate in their thoughts, and it's surprising how much insight and innovation can happen when you do that. Not necessarily directly related with silence, but Boaz Porath, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly, has a question around how do we build into our plans space time to allow making mistakes, to create space for making mistakes. Do you have a perspective on that?
I tried to build that in the time frame, right? Like we're all man. I think a lot of us are probably leaders on this call. We're not new to padding the schedule a bit to put the right kind of time needed. And you don't need a lot of time for mistakes to happen. You just need to be able to pad it enough where you can make more smaller mistakes. So try to get the time where you can to make mistakes. And when you can't, do it more frequently and early. Fixing a small mistake is easier than fixing a bigger mistake. And it starts with earliness, right? Start making little mistakes early instead of trying it near the middle or the end of the project where you have no time to do it. So start it early, start experimenting, and this might be my agile nature. Be very empirical. Like, don't overanalyze something. Do the time to study the problem, but do low fidelity experiments before you begin actually building something and designing it. We can all do paper prototypes. We can all do things. We can all map things out on the whiteboard. Do it at very low fidelity where a bunch of little mistakes add up to big learning before you do the most important complex work.
Yeah. One of the things I also find is, and I think you were hinting at this in an earlier answer, Dave, was just creating space for us to even discuss, hey, what did we try this week that didn't work? So we're not going out of our way to necessarily make mistakes, but hey, creating that psychological safety so people can speak up about, hey, what's something we tried this week? What's an experiment we did? What's something we thought was going to work but didn't work? And what are we learning from that?
And what I like to do is we've all run regular meetings where people show their work and go, this is what we're doing. I try to do alternate weeks of what have we learned? What did we try? So that way I don't mind making mistakes individually and as a team. I try not to make the same mistakes. So I always like to say, let's make new mistakes. So that means how do we share the learning across the wider group? So it's doing that instrumental, here's what we developed, ship, yes, and here's the things we learned along the way. And it's just great to see when people start presenting and sharing it, how it really opens up the space for, yeah, I did this project, I thought this, and I made a similar assumption, because then we can all get smarter.
Mm-hmm. I see, Nidhi, you have a question as well. Do you want to come off mute and actually ask your question?
Well, you mentioned my mom, and one of the stories I always remember was, imagine the 1980s, so before automated bank machines, my mom went to get the money for the week, because you got to think about how our parents had to like take cash out for the week and know exactly what they're going to spend because they couldn't tap. But when my mom came back to the car, it was pouring rain, and we got a car with power locks. So I thought it'd be funny if I used my foot and locked the doors. So she's trying to get in the car and it's pouring rain. And my mom's like, David, you better let me in here. And I'm like, shaking my head no. And then she goes, look, if you let me in, I promise not to spank you. As a naive child, I believed her. I unlocked the door. She came in, grabbed me off the seat, and just lit up my backside. And I couldn't walk it off. And so my mom always encouraged me, but she taught me my disability wouldn't stop me from achieving anything, nor would my disability let me get away with everything. So she was the lady that would give the proper guardrails. And, I'm grateful. And I've had some fantastic leaders. Andrew Workin, a place I've worked for 3 times ago, and I followed him to a couple companies. He taught me how to set a vision, how to get people to buy into it, how to really be so compelled to get people obsessed with the problem and then step away and watch them solution it. So I was grateful for that. And then there's, for those that saw my TED Talk, there was my dad. He was just a fabulous human. He didn't have high school, but he created an HVAC company where his people stayed with him for 25 years. But he was always a teacher and a leader. And, I used to have to struggle getting upstairs every day. When I was a kid, I'd have to crawl up the stairs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And my dad was like, David, this weekend I'm going to build you a ramp so you can easily zoom upstairs. And then, so when I graduated university, I was sitting with my dad, and my dad was having one of those proud moments. He goes, remember when you didn't know what you wanted to do? And I said, you're not going to be a fireman. You're not going to be, whatever it is, you're not going to live under this roof. Remember I gave you that kick in the butt? That's what follow through is, right? And I looked at him and I said, Dad, what we're talking about follow through, all through my years of growing up, you promised to build this ramp for me to make it easier for me to go up the stairs. And like any father, he goes, I did that on purpose. And I thought he was just being a normal dad, smug, like, yeah, but I did that on purpose. But what he said to me was, I'm not always going to be here to build ramps. You're going to have to learn to climb on your own. 2 days later, he passed away. I didn't really know what he meant at the time, but because he hasn't seen me, he didn't get a chance to see all his sacrifices he made, all of the risks he took, to see where I am today, that I've got to lead amazing people. I fly all over the world to deliver product, to lead teams, to coach people. I wish he could have seen me do that figuratively struggle as I did this. And it was all based from his foundation of not building me the ramp. And yeah, I'm just grateful.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Dave. I know that's, I think we all felt it. And I think all of us growing up have had some moments where, we're challenged in different situations. And sometimes those challenges are the things where they're helping us continue to push the edges of what's possible in our life and what's accepted and what's not.
And one more great example I've had is my personal support worker, B. He is, I met him like 20 years ago, and he's traveled with me for work. He would get up at 5:30 in the morning to come get me dressed, shower me, get me dressed, to get me ready for work. And he would travel around the world with me in order for me to bring my best self everywhere. He enabled me to accomplish great things. As a support worker, he doesn't have a fancy title. Sadly, he's even looked down upon. But man, he is one of the greatest leaders I know. I'd like to ask everyone in this call, if you're a leader, who would you be willing to shower to make your organization better? And that's what I've learned from him. Very, very giving, not selfish, not putting himself in front, but to be invisibly present and enable to let others shine. And what a fabulous human.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. And we have a question maybe that helps us go even a tad bit deeper on what you just shared, because we all want to be, many of us want to be this a giving personality, and we run up against the edges at times. And a question we have from Pablo Aguilar is, how do you handle when you have teammates that disagree with you, such that you can continue to work as a team and move forward? Sometimes we want to be in very much that giving space, but it's not always easy. And I'm sure you run into this in your journey as well.
I think if you're a healthy team, you disagree, right? And we disagree often, but it doesn't always have to be my way, right? So I think there's an important thing of having that disagreement. And when you can't settle it any other way, and I'm not saying rock, paper, scissors, but then sometimes, like I said, you got to give them the ability to learn and take ownership that you might need to go with their idea. Because either they're going to learn why you had a different perspective, or you're going to learn they actually had the right way to do it. So I think it's when you're disagreeing, and I'm not saying don't do your deep analysis, don't do a bunch of different things. But at the end of the day, when there's no right way, give it to them to do the way. Take responsibility for it, because if they made a mistake, it's still on you as a leader. But I got to be able to take that responsibility to make them feel safe to do that. So I think if you have disagreement, that's kind of a healthy team. That shows they're psychologically safe. Now, that can go to an extreme. If you get somebody that's just a complete rude person that's just disagreeing to hear themselves, that's an HR thing.
Mm-hmm. Dave, you also talked about, I remember actually when you were sharing that example of hiring someone and then, being in this vulnerable space 3 days later, them showering you down. I remember how you related that to leadership in the sense that leaders have to become vulnerable enough to push decisions down into their teams and giving up control. And this sounds like there's aspects of this here in what you're talking about, because we may have disagreements, maybe there's no clear path, and it's not necessarily my way or the highway. How do we get comfortable giving up control?
Yeah, and for me, that's where my disability was a benefit of. There's no more than giving up control than having people help shower you in places where your bathing suit covers, where you're conditioned to not let others be around. And, I always got to think it's not as vulnerable as that. So at least I have an extreme point of at least it's not that to really go through. But giving up control is the only way you can scale. If I try to keep all the control, then I take away the team from experimenting, right? They got to be able to have that control, autonomy to try three things to pick one. But if it's all got to go through me, their time waiting for me to make that decision takes away the time of learning. I can fix a wrong decision quicker than a non-decision. So what I've tried to do, and it's weird, I think we all try to measure ourselves in certain ways. I try to measure how many decisions is my team making versus what I'm making. Because there's some that I got to make for sure, because I have the view. But what are more of them that I can push down so they're not waiting on me? And furthermore, they're getting the courage to make decisions. Because when I first became a leader, I was so scared because to that point, I was just following someone else's decisions. Now, without no experience, because I was a great individual contributor, they somehow made me a manager or leader. And I'm like, damn, no, I got to make the decisions. How do I do that? So, what I try to do is get my team used to making decisions. So, when it's time for them to be a leader, they've had exposure to it, right? They've been able to do it. Because that's the scariest thing as a leader. What if I'm wrong?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I know we're coming up on time quickly, so if anyone else has questions, feel free to put them in chat, and we'll be sure to ask them. We do have one question, Dave, for you around mentorship. What roles have? What are your thoughts on having a mentor to grow as a leader? What qualities do you look for? And what role have mentors played in your life?
I don't think if I've had mentors, I would be here. I've had the fortune of having good mentors, and I've had bad mentors, so I've had a combination of both. Um, but the great mentors I had were very good at explaining the problem, how they were feeling, and they could not just tell me the problem, because you can get any mentor to go, there was this problem, and I tried this, had this solution, and did that. But I want to know, tell me how you felt, because you just made that sound really easy. And try to understand their feelings and to go through it. And you got to get a mentor and you got to get a champion, what I've learned, because I think the world's getting better at hiring for disability. They still got to get better at growing people with disabilities. So getting a mentor and champion, I think, is important. But a good mentor is consistent, makes time, tries to learn your problems, and then asks you first of, hey, what are you thinking? What are some of the things that are bouncing? They refrain from giving you their perspective and they learn everything you've considered and they ask really good questions to draw that out of you, just like an interviewer, right? Like what makes this interview great is you came up with great questions. I had the easy part of just answering them. But so I think a good mentor knows how to ask the right open-ended, powerful questions to really get you at developing your solution instead of learning what they would have done.
Well, thank you for being so generous, but you're giving amazing answers. And I know everyone here is really benefiting from them and hearing your perspective. Um, Dave, we're quickly coming up on time. I actually have, one of the things I notice in you is just the deep level of self-awareness that you have. And sometimes you're right, the silence really helps. So perhaps it was those years of silence up until the age of 12. But I'm curious if there's ways you continue to deepen into your own awareness of emotions, feelings, situations, people. What's your process around that? What has helped you through life? I find that to be a key ingredient in any leader's growth journey.
I know, I think both not being able to talk and being lonely, because nobody wanted to hang out with the person in a wheelchair, right? So you learn to be comfortable at being alone and you learn to really be in your thoughts. What's really helped me is journaling. I try to journal regularly of, you know what, I really screwed this up. If I had a time machine, what would I do differently? And then I would self-reflect, or like sometimes when I'm not my best self, I'll be in a bad mood, I'll react in a way I'm not proud of. But then I'll try to really, in the next day or so, reflect on it. Why was I like that? Did I come out of a bad meeting before? Did I race just coming up with something? What did I do that I should have done differently? And I think, I don't know if this is a strength or weakness. I'm overly critical of myself, and I shouldn't. If I was coaching somebody, I'd be like, learn to let it go, learn to do that. But personally, I think I'm very self-critical. And, you know, I'm on borrowed time. I I wasn't supposed to be here past 12 years old, right? And so I want to be my best me I can, no matter what little time I have left. And I hear I'm inspiring. I'm hearing to do that. But I do what I do because I want a living. I want to make an impact. I was sharing with my wife the other day, someone came to me and said, I'm so inspired, Dave, that you work. And I'm like, really? I don't think the bank's that inspired when I pay the mortgage. I think they just expect it to happen. But, if I can inspire you to be a better person, to be a better leader, is what I try to be. So I think my self-reflection comes from I don't want to waste any little time I have left on this earth. of not trying to be better because I'm not perfect. I am imperfect, and I have imperfect feet. And I'm not I'm not ashamed of my imperfections, but it doesn't mean I don't want to work on them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, letting go of our expectations of perfection from ourselves and perfections from leaders around us, whether they be in city governments, national governments, corporate leaders. Uh, no, none of us are perfect, and there is so much room for continuous improvement. In fact, all of us, we are on our own individual growth journeys, and leaning into that journey itself is a virtue in and of itself. So I love that you shared that journaling played a huge role for yourself, and really as a practice to self-reflect, as a practice to sit with your thoughts. Because one of the sayings I love to share with people at times is, don't believe everything you think. It doesn't mean everything you think is wrong, but you don't need to believe everything you think. Sometimes we need to just sit with those thoughts that say, I should have done this or could have done that. And they're not always true.
Well, as a product maker, right, I got to remind myself, how do I know? Because I'll be like, we should build this, do it this way. How do I know? Right. And I got to always remember that. How do I know? And even internally, I'm like, how do I know this? Or why do I believe this? Right. Because part of it is you try to imagine a world that doesn't exist. Because in 1971, me being in front of all you today didn't seem possible. But if you can imagine a different world, then you have a different world available to you.
Yeah. I think those are probably the words that we're going to wrap up with today. And I love the spirit, I think, that those words bring, which is when we can see a world that we would like to see, the one that we would like to create, the one that we would like to envision, then that world can become available to us. And if there's anyone, frankly, that I can think of that really brings that home and has made that a reality, I think of you, Dave.
Thank you.
You have really been able to see a different world and actually create it and live it. So thank you for being such an amazing inspiration and sharing your wisdom with us today.
And thank you for having me. I'm glad that your co-host follows me on LinkedIn, or I would have not had the opportunity to be here.
Yes. Thank you to Nidhi for helping bring us together and helping surface the opportunity for this conversation. I hope everyone is inspired and has some great nuggets that they can walk away with, that they can go apply back to their day-to-day journey as a leader and the growth journey. If you'd like to continue any of the journey here today, you're welcome to join the Wise Leader community on Teams. And as before, we'll post the links to mine and Dave's profiles in chat. So you're welcome to connect with us if there's further questions, because we know there's some questions we didn't get to. But thank you again, Dave. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you for taking time to share your journey with us today and really inspiring us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening, and I appreciate it.
Likewise.